In the second podcast on morals and markets, I will continue to explore the underlying assumptions of economics and to think about the ways in which the discipline has been narrowed down to the exclusion of heterodox approaches. Over the last 50 or so years, thinking about society has been increasingly dominated by economic discourse, which makes it all the more important to understand the assumptions upon which the discipline of economics is based. We need to rethink and to develop an alternative approach. And in search of this ambition, today I'm in conversation with Avner, the Emeritus Professor of Economic History at the University of Oxford and the author of a number of highly original, provocative and important books, which we will be discussing in our conversation today. I'd like to start, Avner, by asking you to say a little bit about one of your books, which is about the development of the Nobel Prize in Economics, a book you wrote with Gabriel Sonderberg, The Nobel Factor, the Prize in Economics, Social Democracy and the Market Turn. Before we go on to explore what you mean by the market turn, let me start off by asking you more specifically, why was the Nobel Prize created and what impact do you think it had upon the nature of modern economics?
Well, the importance of the Nobel Prize is that it's a kind of a quality hallmark. So if it's been awarded a Nobel Prize, it must be true. That is the assumption in the natural sciences, even in literature. And so economics achieved a great coup in creating a Nobel Prize for itself. This only happened after they realized the brand value of the Nobel Prize. This thing, economics was not among the original Nobel Prizes, which began at the beginning of the 20th century, but was added in 1968. And in the book I described how this came about. To cut a long story short, it was the culmination of a struggle between the conservative forces of finance and business and the political forces of the welfare state, more particularly the social democratic governments of Sweden, which in the 60s was at the very forefront of the development of social democracy. The story is long and complicated. Perhaps the point to take it up is the conflict between the central bank, in Sweden, which regarded itself which took on the role of protecting the currency, sound money, so to speak, and the social democratic government, which wanted to spend money, especially on housing. The autonomy of the central bank allowed it eventually to fund a Nobel Prize in Economics in 1968 and to effectively staff the committee with people who saw the world from their point of view. So there is the irony here that the most advanced social democracy in the world at the time, Sweden, had created this weapon against itself, which is what it turned out to be.
That's very interesting. So you say it's not funded by the Nobel Foundation itself, it's funded by the Swedish Central Bank. But does the Nobel Foundation itself award the prize?
Well, the prize is awarded by the Nobel Foundation, but essentially by the various Swedish academies, depending on the discipline, and except for the Peace Prize, which is awarded by the Norwegian Parliament, with the idiosyncrasies you can expect from politicians giving a prize of that kind. At any rate, this particular one is awarded by the Royal Academy of Sciences, which includes the social sciences. However, the procedure is the same procedure as applies to the awards in the sciences, not in medicine, which again is awarded by a different body. So it has the imprimatur of science. The funding is guaranteed from the Swedish central bank, in other words, by the Swedish taxpayer.
That's very interesting. I remember speaking to a Swedish taxpayer a few years back at a conference who said that the prize should be abolished because it was an ideological construct. I wonder if you could say what your view is on that. I mean, who has been awarded the prize? Has it been people of a particular ideological perspective with only a minority from other views?
Well, we've investigated the political orientation of the prize and whether it has one. And from this study, we reached the conclusion that the objective function, in other words, the purpose of the Nobel Prize, of the Nobel Prize Committee, was to maintain the credibility of the prize. In other words, to acquire as broad as possible support for the prize, which meant essentially covering all bases. So if you look at left and right classifications for economists, for the period that we covered, which is up to 2005, they're evenly matched.
Really?
Now, this is not something that's likely to arise by chance. This kind of parity arises not only in politics, but also in methodology. So the Keynesian and the monetarists are also evenly matched. The theorists and the applied economists are also evenly matched. So the whole thing is very well balanced. And as I said, I think the main reason is that they want to keep the discipline behind them, which they have succeeded.
Yeah.
Now, we've also looked to see what economists really believe. And contrary to what you might think, the majority support social democratic views. 2/3 to 1/3 support social democratic views. There have been, you can look in the book to see the method we used. That hasn't been challenged by reviewers. Now, that doesn't mean that economists are not more right-wing than other social scientists. Other social scientists are just more left-wing than economists. So about 2/3 of them support social democratic views. So in that respect, the prize is politically biased, or was politically biased.
So could you then explain the title? Because anybody who reads the title might see the phrase, the market turn, and assume that the Nobel Prize is like propagating the market turn. You're taking now a much more nuanced view than that, I think.
Well, it's an element in the market turn. You could say that it helped to legitimize the market turn. So the market turn is a shift which takes place in policy norms in the 1970s and 1980s from what is generally a social democratic orientation towards a neoliberal orientation. Social democratic orientation very generally is a policy norm which attempts to achieve security for all, to provide for all. The neoliberal norm is a little more complicated. It's not entirely clear what it actually intends to achieve. It only argues these things implicitly, and the implicit argument is that social democracy is inefficient in the sense that it does not fully exploit the resources of society, and that a better way to do this would be to rely on private enterprise.
Yeah. I just want to try and understand how particular views become dominant within the field of economics. And you're talking about the Nobel Prize, which you say was almost validating all types of economics, but still validating economics as, if like, the queen of disciplines in the social sciences. I was very struck when I was still in employment and chairing appointment committees in the Faculty of Economics in Cambridge, how the appointing committee would mainly look at where people had published. They would say, have you got articles in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, the Review of Economic Studies, Econometrica? If you don't have them in those places, then it doesn't really matter. Which then means that the gatekeepers of those journals are enforcing a particular view of the discipline, which could argue is highly mathematical. It's like the Nobel Prize, it's almost physics envy. I wonder if you've got any views about the way in which views are being limited by this particular structure of the publishing of economics and the appointments which then follows from it.
Well, that's correct. So getting ahead in economics involves publishing in the top 5 journals, so-called, which means there's enormous pressure to publish there. So the editors of these journals are, in a sense, the gatekeepers of economics. There is a question of what exactly gets through the gates.
Yeah.
So if there are 5 journals, they might have some differences, and they do have some differences. I'd say that there is economics is a kind of sect, so everyone has to believe, what's the credo? I'm not someone who says that very frequently, but basically you believe in the Trinity, the Holy Ghost, Father, and so on. So there is a core doctrine at the heart of everything, which is that markets are efficient. Efficient is a little misleading. What does that mean? It doesn't mean all that much. It means that under some ideal conditions, after a period of trading, no goods are left on the shelf. In other words, no resources are wasted. It says nothing about distribution. There is another part to this, which is called the second theorem of welfare economics, which says that if we have this state of bliss, then this is also what is known as Pareto efficiency, which means that no change can take place without harming somebody. What that means is that all resources are fully used by their rightful owners. Nothing it says about what confers the right to ownership. In other words, these doctrines essentially provide support for the status quo, for the rights of property, for the distribution of wealth and income, and so on. So that's the core doctrine. This doctrine is essentially untestable.
Yeah.
So there are various empirical programs around it, but in a sense, everyone at the door has to say that they subscribe to these doctrines, and then they can actually pursue the faith in a variety of different ways. But they're not allowed to question it. And again, I have to qualify this because economics also has pretensions to be an empirical science. It's not pure mathematics. It's an empirical science. And occasionally, observations are inconsistent with the doctrine. The most egregious example of that is it turns out that for these models to work, people have to be constantly pursuing their self-interest as defined by themselves. It turns out that they don't. They have all sorts of other motives, so that's called behavioral economics. So long as behavioral economics was regarded as challenging the premises, it was left at the door, but it has since been admitted. And it's made its accommodations, and you can believe in both things, in different things at the same time. That's also something that the religious precedent allows you to do. I have to say there's another development arising out of the inconsistency between observation and theory, which is what is known as the empirical turn. Mm-hmm. So in its pure form, in its pure doctrinal forms, economics has been shown to be untenable in the real world. And so there's been a crisis of high theory, and large numbers of economists have responded to this by turning their backs on theory altogether and carrying out what are known as field experiments or natural experiments, which essentially use the medical model of validating drug, which is treatment in effect. Mm-hmm. Essentially, you apply a treatment to one group and you withhold it from another group, and you try to measure the effect the treatment has. So, for example, you go to Africa and you give some country dwellers mosquito nets, and another group of country dwellers, you give them cash, and you see who does better. That's a canonical type of.
Yeah.
Now that's really taken over, in the sense that a Nobel Prize are being awarded for this, and it's taken very seriously, but it's not really consistent with the core doctrine that I mentioned before, and that's part of the crisis in economics. There are other areas of economics which are in crisis because reality does not match the doctrine.
Right. So you say that the core assumption you set out will remain there, and there's a struggle about how to.
That's right.
To deal with that tension.
Especially since people, the training of economists takes them through the doctrine in quite a lot of detail, and those who make it to a professional career can be trusted to have mastered it.
So picking up your theological metaphor, it's like being a seminarian, and you learn the mode of analysis, the way of thinking. It's very difficult then to escape from that.
That's right. And if we go further, we have a variety of sects. We have established churches. We have nonconformist churches.
Indeed.
And so on and so forth.
So you're suggesting is economics is not as rigid as I suggested at the beginning, or are you? Are you saying that you can disagree provided you stick to this core assumption, and more heterodox people who don't accept those sets of assumptions will not be admitted into the profession, into the major economic departments?
That's right. Interestingly enough, they do get admitted to minor university departments, maybe because the departments are so minor that no self-respecting economist wants to work there. But
could you give an example?
Yes, I can give. Yes, there's a wonderful example. So I think the best heterodox economist in the world today is someone called Steve Keen. Mm-hmm. He's one. I could give several more examples of this happening. So Steve Keen he's an Australian. He became quite well known in Australia. As I said, his employer was, I don't remember whether it's the third or the fourth ranked university out of 3 or 4 in Sydney. And he became quite well known. I think his best known work is still called Debunking Economics, so you can imagine how popular this made him. And the only way they could find to get rid of him was to close down the department. So they closed down the department, they disbanded the department, made Keen leave, and then they created the department again and started hiring people. Something similar happened in Notre Dame University in the United States, where actually this is largely designed to get rid of, there are 1 or 2 Marxists there, but I think it's largely designed to get rid of an historian of economics called Philip Mirowski.
Oh, yes.
So the department was closed down. The people were not fired. They dispersed into other departments, and he became a professor of the history of science, although he doesn't think economics is a science. Well,
yes, I can think of other examples as well. Like in my own University of Cambridge, there's a Department of Land Economy,
yes,
which is where the heterodox economists are, and indeed even in the business school.
Yes.
So it's whereas the Faculty of Economics itself fits very much into the paradigm.
You can ask what happened to Steve Keen. So Steve Keen then came to Britain and was appointed to Kingston University. Now, Kingston University is, in the UK, we have a national ranking of universities, and Kingston University is not very far from the bottom. And he was there for a few years.
Yeah.
And he got ousted from there as well. The interesting thing is that he now supports himself by crowdfunding very successfully. So even I support him.
Good. Well, perhaps other listeners to this podcast will follow suit. But this is very interesting then about the power structure, which leads to economics in the way that we have it.
I think something that's more important, really, is that people, that certain policy positions are basically taken by economists in our society, and especially macro policy, central banks, running monetary policy, central banks. And actually, business likes to use economists. In a way, the most useful thing that economists can do is cost-benefit analysis. So it's evaluating projects. It's not as useful as one might think, because they're more wrong than right. And when I say that, this is actually based on research.
Yes.
Nevertheless, it's good that someone can do it rationally and have the competences to weigh the pros and cons and so on.
Yeah. So you're agreeing with what I said at the beginning, which is there's a lot of policy debate thinking about society is dominated by economic discourse, and economists get into these key positions, whether it be in business corporations, the Bank of England. Now, let's pick up what you were saying about the market turn, which is in the title of your book about the Nobel Prize. You started touching on that, and I think you were suggesting there's a market turn from the 70s or 80s. I just wonder if you could explain to us why that market turn occurred. The book which I often use when I'm lecturing, which you might not agree with, is Daniel Rogers' book, Age of Fracture, in which he talks about this domination of economics in the discourse. And he says there's a turning away in the 70s and 80s, away from thinking about society as being about solidity, solidarity, collective institutions, managed markets, stable identities, into a sense of multiple identities, deregulated markets. And he says this is both on the left and on the right, that on the left we start to think about sexual identity, cultural identity. So it becomes about the individual rather than the collectivity of a trade union. What is your answer to this question? Why do you think the market turn occurred when it did?
Well, maybe first we should establish what the market turn is.
Yes.
And I think the market turn is best identified by example. In other words, by looking at the policies. And the leader in this respect, not the first, but the leader was Pinochet in Chile. But the leader by example in this respect is actually the United Kingdom and the Thatcher regime. And the dominant thrust of their policy is to take the business corporation as the model for policy execution, where possible to outsource governing functions to actual corporations, in other words, to privatize, and where not, to model government services on the incentive structures of private corporations. Economics actually played very little role in all of this because orthodox economics doesn't have a lot to say about ownership. It actually has nothing to say about ownership. The people who have something to say about ownership are Austrian economists who believe in the creative role of the entrepreneur. And so you could think of the corporate CEO, the corporate hero CEO, as standing for that kind of thing, as a substitute for fuddy-duddy bureaucrats who, so Humphrey, yes, who only know how to stop things and don't know how to get things done and so on. So economics actually has little to say about this. Where economics does make a contribution is that economics essentially relies on markets, and it says that markets are efficient. And so the neoliberals have been pleased to call what they do the market turn, as if we're turning to markets. But it's not a turn to markets, actually. What these corporations seek is not competition, but monopoly. They seek market power, and neoliberals have nothing against that. Not only that, they think this can only be achieved with the help of the state. So the state has a very important role in allowing corporations to play their game. And the implicit argument is that this will be good for all of us. The reason this is has been so successful is that this has been very good for some of us. And this is my take on this whole story, that a crucial element in all of this is to recruit the ordinary voter into the capitalist class. And this is done by making them owner-occupiers of their own home, and therefore enmeshing them in long-term financial investments and in a relationship with the financial sector. And for the first movers, this was extremely advantageous. So the first generation of people who went through this saw their assets rise much faster than the debts they had incurred. And so a whole generation enjoyed windfall wealth in the form of rising house prices, and that inclined them to support parties who supported this reform. I don't know whether it's... Economics also had another role, I think, which is to actually persuade the policy class, which basically means civil servants, corporate executives, people of that kind, that private is better. This was facilitated by the reform in higher education. So we have mass higher education starting in the 1970s. In the States, it's a little earlier. This reform starts producing large numbers of people with training in economics or semi-training in economics, which is even worse. PPE comes to mind in the UK. And by the 1980s, these people are filling medium-level positions in both the civil service and in private corporations. And they just know that private is better because no one has told them anything else. And that's what they've studied at university. And who are they to question their teachers? So that's actually quite important. Now, I'm leading to a point here. And the point is this, that these people essentially persuaded the social democratic parties to abandon social democracy and embrace neoliberalism. This happens in a very short period of time. Pretty much every social democratic party in the developed world made this shift, I would say, quite narrowly between 1978 and 1982. This requires closer study. Someone has already studied it in a book that's too long for me to read.
What was that?
Mudge. Her name is Mudge. But this has already been identified, but I don't think it's entered the historiographical discourse sufficiently. So that's the market turn. Now, why did it happen? I think my take on this is that this is a blowback by the financial and business elites to safeguard their privileges, that they felt that social democracy was threatening them, both in the form of high taxation and their social status. So there is a well-concerted operation, which the ground for this was laid over a period of 30 years in the annual meetings of the Mont Pelerin Society. There's a famous Powell Memorandum in the United States from 1973, I think, which lays down the whole program, which actually, as it unfolded, with very precisely. So I think this is well planned. This is well endowed. Think tanks, endowed chairs, the development of whole disciplines like law and economics, rational choice. So this is a very solid movement which had quite impressive intellectual foundations as well. But the purpose, I think, was to maintain the privileged in their privileged positions, and that has succeeded, because one of the main consequences of the neoliberal revolution is a large increase in inequality. In the UK, most of the rise of income inequality which took place in the 10 years of the Thatcher government. Yeah. After that, it stabilized at a higher level, but it rose by something like 50% on the measure that's used, the Gini coefficient. Inequality rose by something like 50% over a period of 10 years. So if we hypothesize that that was the purpose, then it was successful.
Let me press you on this Avner. Okay, so accept the market turn, and you're using that as a synonym, I think, for neoliberalism,
yeah.
Although one might press you a little bit on that if we have time, about are there different types of neoliberalism. But you're saying that this market turn takes place, and you're almost seeing this as a cynical, self-serving conspiracy by wealthy elites, financiers, Wall Street, the city of London. Could one put a different spin on this and say, well, actually, no, there was actually a crisis of capitalism in the 1970s. In Britain and in other OECD countries, the profit rate was being squeezed. I mean, partly, of course, because of the oil shock, but not just that. I think a slowing down of productivity growth, perhaps, the inability any longer, like in the 30 years after the war, to pay decent profits, keep prices down, and pay decent wages. And that is being squeezed. And people like Wolfgang Streeck are talking about a fiscal crisis as well, that the levels of taxation to provide the welfare, which is underlying that social compact between capital, labour and state, is being squeezed. I mean, is it arising from those, if you like, structural features which certain people can exploit for their own self-interest, rather than how you've just been presenting it, which almost as if it's that group of people being able to shape policy by themselves, by their funding of research institutes? I could see what you mean. Something like, James Buchanan at the Virginia School of Economics, I think, was being funded by some of the right-wing political financial elite. But I wonder if you could just respond to my suggestion. There might be structural features as well.
Okay, first, I'd just like to say briefly, you said cynical.
Or realistic, you might say.
Well, these people would say, what's cynical about looking after yourself,
Okay.
That's perfectly reasonable. And indeed...
All the assumptions of economics that you outlined.
That's right. So there's nothing cynical about it. I don't really think that these two lines of explanation are in conflict with each other. Yeah. They reinforce each other. In that the trends that you describe, you should mention deindustrialization, which is very important.
That's a major thing.
Create the incentives for this group of people, these institutions, this group of people to mobilize, energize them, to move into action.
Yep.
So all of that is correct. It creates a sense of crisis. You remember in Britain there's talk of a military coup in the late 60s. So I don't think that there's any contradiction between the two. These two trends reinforce each other.
Okay. No, so you gave housing as an example of becoming involved within a constituency which support the market turn.
Yeah.
People, I suppose, of our age, dare I say it, who have gained from being early movers in buying housing have gained immensely from that, whereas the next generation won't. But I think you're saying there's a much wider sense of financialization within society, which is the other side of the coin of deindustrialization. That the size of the financial service sector in the UK is really very, very high since the 70s and 80s.
Well, I'd say it's the other side of neoliberalism, because the people who ultimately benefit from neoliberalism are not the entrepreneurs, not the business people, but the financiers.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you take water was privatized with the promise of getting rid of fuddy-duddy bureaucrats who ran it in favor of enterprising entrepreneurs who would get us both lower prices and cleaner water and so on. What happened, in fact, and there's nothing to prevent it, and perhaps it was even envisaged to some extent, was that the water companies were picked up either by Australian conmen buccaneers like the Macquarie Group, who took on enormous loans, paid themselves enormous dividends, left the cupboard bare, and the rivers full of sewage. The other people who purchased these companies were the nationalized water companies of other countries.
Yeah. But let me follow up on housing a minute before we come on to this whole big issue about where the divide should be between private and public, upon which you've written another very important book. So you say that housing, the right to buy, the selling off of council housing, the encouragement of owner occupation has led a lot of people to buy into this market turn. And we now have, you say, a serious housing crisis as a result of that. House prices have gone up so much and people can't afford to buy. I think when we first bought our houses, the average age of buying a first house was about 25 or 26, whereas now it's 35 or 36.
For those who buy.
For those who can buy.
Yes.
In fact, the biggest...
Majority can't buy.
The majority can't buy. The biggest tenure for people who are early adults is living with their parents.
Which is sofa.
Yes, or sofa surfing. Now, you take a rather pessimistic view, I suppose. We've all become capitalists, or some of us have become capitalists. Some of us have gained. Some people are being excluded. The top quartile or so of the population has gained. Bottom quartile, their wages have not really risen for the last 20, 30 years. We've become capitalists, so that some of us have engaging in large financial transactions. So what's the solution to the housing crisis? If you were advising the new Labour government, which says it's going to solve the housing crisis, what would you do? Would you become like Vienna, which many people hold up as a model of some sort of social housing of different tenures, or what would you do? Would you go back to Harold Macmillan and Clement Attlee building massive numbers of council housing? Would you go, when your first book was about the taxation of land values, would you go back to the taxation of land values because people who own land are gaining massive unearned increments? So just wonder if you could just say, what is your solution?
Yes, in order to answer this question, we want to look a little further back to the origins of owner occupation. When neoliberalism came around, about half of homes in Britain were already in owner occupation. And the Conservatives identified this as a potential Conservative constituency. But owner occupation is actually a creation of social democracy. This is not sufficiently understood. So under capitalism, under laissez-faire, what we had in Britain is a buy-to-let system in which housing was provided by entrepreneurs who bought up, builders set up, built houses, which they sold to entrepreneurs who then rented them out. Mm-hmm. The length of time depended on the income. So manual workers could rent for the week or for the month or for the quarter, and better off people could rent by the year or sometimes for longer than that. But that was the system. It was very expensive for reasons mostly because of high cost of capital. I explain this in the book. So the First World War abolished this system by imposing rent control. And in the interwar years, we had the emergence of two tenures. One was public housing, which was built on a fairly large scale. Between about 1920 and 1980. So that provided secure housing for the lowest earners. The second trend was owner occupation. Owner occupation was given a favorable tax treatment. That was not the most important thing. The most important thing is that the finance was provided not for profit by mutual societies, which raised money from savers and used this money to lend out to buyers. Mm-hmm. What that meant is that the amount that was lent out was restricted by the amount that was saved. So there's a direct link between earnings and house purchase, which actually kept prices at a reasonable level. In the 1930s, prices even fell.
Yes.
As I know from reading an unpublished, an article yet unpublished. So that was a self-regulating housing market in which owner occupation proceeded. I actually think that owner occupation is the superior tenure because it gives you control over your life. Mm-hmm. Essentially, you're not beholden to a local authority, you're not beholden to a landlord. So it is much to be desired from that point of view. I also think we need public housing. We need public housing because if we have a competitive labor market, which is the ideal of most of our governments, wages will be driven so low that people will not be able to afford housing. So a large part of the population will be squeezed out of housing, which is what we see today.
Yeah.
So you need to provide subsidized housing the way we provide family credit as well. That's another example. You know, it's not the only case where we subsidize low earners in order to get the benefits of the market. So in these cases, we would subsidize housing in order to get the benefits of a less regulated labor market. I don't think that's such a great idea, but let's assume that it is. So we had that system until the 1980s, and what happened in the 1980s is that banks replaced building societies as the source of finance, and indeed building societies were encouraged to turn themselves into banks. Now, the difference between a bank and a building society is that a bank can create money out of nothing. Now, before you turn off your television set or however you're viewing about this, I should say that it's not that they're completely unrestricted. They're restricted by the amount of collateral that's posted. And it looks as if housing is a very good collateral, yes, because you can always take the house, repossess the house, and sell it. So the banks were very happy to lend against houses. They didn't need any money. They created the money. Okay, they did need some money. I don't want to go into the details, but basically they could do something that building societies could not do. Yeah. In other words, they could generate credit without sacrifice for good collateral, for credible borrowers.
Okay.
Now, this is very important because since credit flowed freely, that raised the value of houses.
Yeah.
That raised the price of houses. So what's the response to that? The response to that is that people pay a larger share of their income to service the debt.
For more years.
For more years sometimes, yes. Now, they think it doesn't matter because the value of the house appreciates even more. But it doesn't matter because sooner or later they pay so much to service the debt that they don't have anything left for anything else. And we don't have anything for anything else, then the people who previously they bought things from become unemployed, and we have a financial crisis, which is what we had in 2008.
So you're really sketching a subprime mortgage crisis and so on.
That's one of the outcomes, yes.
of it. So just to summarize.
So what should we do?
Well, what to do, I think what you're saying, can I suggest, this is what you're saying, you disagree with me. You're almost saying demutualization of the building societies, the Halifax and so on, was a mistake, and we need to go back to the 1930s form of building societies, which is just deposits in, loans out, not leading to this, in fact, speculative increase of house prices, not speculative, but credit-fueled increase. So your solution then is not to go for mass public housing, as after the war, some public housing, but not necessarily by councils, could be by housing associations. Is this
actually? Well,
no.
The question is, I actually think that public housing is a very necessary element in this story, and whether it's mass or non-mass. Some people would argue that it was non-mass in the interwar years,
right.
that the really mass public housing came in the post-war years. So I would actually wish to see public housing on a large scale, but however large the scale, it takes a long time to dent the need. The other is to, I think that mutualization is a good policy. Whether it's possible or not, nobody talks about this. There is one mutual society, which is the Nationwide.
Yeah.
Nationwide is actually a bank as well, because it does have access to financial markets. It's allowed to borrow in financial markets. And I think it doesn't have direct access to clearing. I'm not quite sure about this. So that's the difference between a building society and a clearing bank. But nevertheless, it can borrow in financial markets, and it does borrow in financial markets. So, but at any rate, it's very successful.
Yeah.
Now, whether it's a good thing or bad thing depends on your objective. So I think that if you're a banker, you don't actually want to relinquish this social role of financing society's needs. And bankers are quite influential in our society. So I think that if our criterion is maximizing welfare, those are the policies that I would advocate. Since no one else seems to be talking about this, I have a feeling that it's not going to happen very, very rapidly. But in terms of understanding what is going on, there's another view. Actually, there is a serious problem in the fiscal side of housing, which is that taxation of housing is regressive, very regressive. And when I started doing my research, which is almost 50 years ago, whenever I told people about land values taxation, the economists laughed. Everyone knows that this is just stupid and so on, but they never explained why. And Ricardo actually thought it wasn't a bad idea, and Adam Smith didn't think it was a bad idea. Yeah. So nowadays, quite a few economists have come around to this idea, and even there's some talk in the Labour government at the moment of capping the gain that landlords can make when the land is converted to housing. Yeah. So this idea is coming back, and so I think there's a lot to be said for reforming local taxation to make it progressive, and for land values taxation. So that's an additional resource.
Yes. Okay. Well, I also advocated that sort of thing. So I think we can agree on that. Martin Wolf for the Financial Times is an example of somebody who's advocating going back to Henry George in a way.
Yes.
And land values.
Well, Henry George said that would be enough.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we're going to go that far. But let's now go back to what you were saying about privatization of water, and then, in fact, not working, filling our streams and rivers with sewage. And there's this big question which you addressed in one of your recent books about where should the private-public divide be set. And in one of your articles, you referred to Keynes reacting to Hayek's Road to Serfdom from 1944, in which Keynes says something like, well, Friedrich, you've told us that private markets are better, but there had to be some public role. But you haven't told us exactly where the line should be. Hayek believed that socialism is impossible. Markets are spontaneous. Planners can't determine where assets should be allocated. But you say, well, okay, even if one believed that the state should be rolled back, it hasn't been rolled back. It's still a very, very big part of the total economy, and economists seem to have not almost noticed that in a way. I think in your book, Understanding the Private-Public Divide, Markets, Governments and Time Horizons, you do tell us where the divide between the public and the private spheres should be set. I think you also say in that it's currently being set at the wrong place. So I wonder if you could just explain to me where you think the divide should be set.
Yes. Well, this insight arises from a simple feature of business, which is that investment needs to be financed. And when it's financed, it needs to be, the investment needs to be serviced and repaid. Let's leave aside repaid and talk just about serviced. Servicing also implies a repayment period, and so the period in which the investment effectively needs to be repaid is restricted. And it's well defined, and it's defined by the interest rate. For example, if we take a loan of £100 at 10% interest, then every year we pay £10, and after 10 years, we've covered the amount of the loan. That's called the payback period. So what I argue is that anything that takes longer cannot be done by business alone. In fact, business needs much less time, a much shorter time to pay off, because business needs to cover not only the cost of finance, it also needs to make a profit. Also, business usually does discounting. So the dollar or the pound in 10 years' time is actually worth only about 60 pence. Yeah. So at 10% interest, I've done this calculation in my head, so don't hold me to that figure. What that means is that if we do discounting, then in fact, the loan needs to be, the payback period is only about 6 years long. So that means that under competitive market conditions, the investment has to pay off within a limited period of time. Businesses usually add what is known as the hurdle rate. There's some multiple of this. So usually they look for repayment in 4, 5, maximum 6 years. And I have some references about that. But most human undertakings actually take longer than that. And so does that mean that they're not carried out? Or does that mean that they're not carried out by business? Well, no. Business does undertake longer-term ventures. And but in order to go in there, it needs to be supported. It needs to be provided with some kind of guarantee, some kind of support, and this is forthcoming. The state does support longer-term private ventures. Many things are done not for profit. We should remember that. Education in this country, health services, science, culture, infrastructure, roads, but not water, for example. So a lot of things are done either by government or not-for-profit, but a lot of what looks like private enterprise is actually subsidized by government one way or another, and I call this a franchise. In other words, society undertakes its long-term projects by empowering private companies to deliver it and supporting it in a variety of ways. Now, we've had a notorious example of this in the private finance initiative, which the New Labour introduced. So they thought they needed private capital in order to invest in long-term projects like hospitals and schools, but they didn't want to damage their balance sheet by borrowing and putting it on the books. So they concocted a scheme by which they empowered private companies to do these things and guaranteed them a return that was twice as high as the cost would have been to the public sector to borrow and build these things themselves.
They could always borrow at a cheaper rate.
Yeah. Now, the franchise system, there are other ways of doing this. I won't go into this. There are 2 other ways of doing this. But this is the most important one, the franchise system. The franchise system requires collusion between the private and the public sector. In other words, the public operator, the civil service or the politician needs to transfer public resources to the private entrepreneur. And this quite frequently gives rise to quid pro quo. Mm-hmm. So this is a massive generator of corruption. And if you have the impression that our society is much more corrupt than it used to be, you need a long memory to remember a period when it wasn't so corrupt. I think this largely rises from neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is itself a franchise. Yeah. Because what it does is it imposes market methods with government support, government enforcement. That is what it is about. The financial sector, the whole of the financial sector is a franchise of this kind because it's underpinned by the central bank and an implicit bailout guarantee. So in fact, much of what looks like private enterprise markets, in quotation marks, is actually state-supported and would not take place without government support. Let me pick you up
on this point about corruption. You refer to a quid pro quo.
Yeah.
In one of your books, you refer to an integrity revolution. You're saying in the 18th century, you have a rather corrupt system. You can buy constituencies. It's got the rotten boroughs. Sort of 3 voters with 2 MPs, that sort of thing, and you can buy them. And then in the period from the end of the 18th century to about 1870, you have this integrity revolution. You have the Northcote-Trevelyan reforms of a meritocratic civil servant who hasn't read PPE at Oxford, but probably classics at Oxford or Cambridge.
Mathematics.
Oh, mathematics, even better. So you have these people who are seen as being, if like, incorruptible, the Sir Humphreys, who get the bad reputation of being saying no, but they're actually carefully assessing things, in your view. So it's expertise, it's people who are in a post for a long time, they understand issues. So you're saying that integrity revolution has a counter-revolution, and we now don't accept expertise so much. There's a constant rotation of people within posts, a revolving door between the private and public sector, franchises being sold, and we've seen some of the worst of that with the PB, the personal protective equipment scandal during COVID. So I wonder if you could just say what you feel about this, because I think there's a tension in your work. You're saying that that we need to have these experts, we need to have meritocrats, we need to go back to the Sir Humphreys or the Northcote-Trevelyan reports. But you're also saying that democracy is hostile to expertise, is hostile to meritocracy, is short-sighted. They're voting for politicians who will give them what they want now. So in your book, The Challenge of Affluence, you're saying that actually we're becoming more myopic. We want pleasure now. We're on a hedonic treadmill of desire, if I remember your phrase correctly. So how are you going to have a solution? If you seem to be rather sceptical about the democracy, almost in the same way as James Buchanan, that politicians and the electorate want to have more welfare, more goods now. They're not looking for the long term. But if you've got a democracy which is myopic and is not looking for long term, how are you going to break out of this this bind, out of this downward spiral, if you like?
Well, you're very keen on solutions.
Well, what's the solution, Avner? Come on, you've told us a lot of problems.
Well,
what is the solution?
I'm satisfied in trying to understand what is happening. I'm more modest about...
You're a historian, so as I am. So
that's right, yes. So what I argued about bureaucracy is that it has the right incentives. It provides with the decision makers with incentives to pursue the public interest. They're not necessarily doing this because they are superior in terms of their morals and so on. However, although they are inculcated with the public spirit, but they're also well rewarded.
Mm-hmm.
So it's worth their while. This whole system emerged, by the way, in response to war. When European countries started taking war seriously, they realized that you couldn't fake merit. And therefore you needed to find ways of advancing the best and the brightest. The trouble about the best and the brightest is that they're distrusted by the common person, who is neither best nor bright. So that's the problem with democracy. There's another problem with business. Business doesn't like people who pursue the public good because it might go against their own interests. So the two very powerful forces of society, democracy and business, which are actually opposed to what I call a Weberian democracy, Weberian bureaucracy. Weberian bureaucracy is a bureaucracy which has self-regulating incentives. That's a system. Empirically, we know that the way out of corruption for developing countries is to actually establish Weberian bureaucracies. So that there's empirical evidence for that sort of thing. Now, when we say that democracy thinks that Jack is as good as his master, we intuitively sympathize with that, some of us at any rate. But I think democracy is also in crisis. Mm-hmm. And democracy is in crisis because the voters seem to choose the wrong things.
Yes.
I'd say, of course they choose the things that I don't like, so they're wrong in that sense. But they're also the wrong things in the sense that objective outcomes are bad. We've seen a very good example of that in the Brexit decision. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult to find a good argument in favor of Brexit today, except the breast-beating me of nationalism. Mm. So democracy is in crisis.
Yeah. So we see this in the podcast, which has taken place a few days before we're recording this podcast, between former President Trump and Elon Musk. Well, I didn't watch this one, but so I mean, that is really an example of what you're suggesting. Are you almost saying that Elon Musk, in a self-interested way, is almost fomenting a dislike of democracy, because or a crisis of democracy, because that would play to his best interests?
Structurally, that seems to me to be the case, and that business on the whole has not supported social democracy. Indeed, what happened is the other way around. Social democracy has rushed to align itself with business.
Yeah.
And one of the consequences of this is that the forces of right-wing populism have picked up part of the social democratic mantle.
Yes.
So some of the populist right-wing populist parties have elements in their platforms which want to restore the balance in favor of workers instead of ordinary people, and that is part of their appeal. And so, in a sense, they've taken over the manual worker constituency of the old social democratic parties, which are now supported by coalitions of minorities of various kinds.
And that's been possible partly because of deindustrialization.
Yes,
you talked about destroying those communities and the unions which supported it.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
But do I have solutions?
Well, yes. Well, we'll be coming to the end of our conversation. So let me press you about, we're both historians, we're both happier with looking at the past and how we get to our current malaise, if you like, than finding solutions. But I suppose one thing which is happening at the moment is AI. Is that going to upset everything that we've been talking about? Is that the new, if like, structural crisis I was talking about in the 70s and 80s? Is that going to change everything we've been talking about in ways which are now difficult to predict?
Well, looking in my mind as we're making this conversation was the possibility that this might all be verging on the obsolete. So what are the two mechanisms that we've described? So we've talked about democracy, one person, one vote. So it's a system in which power is fragmented and is concentrated by some kind of mechanism. The other is economics. Economics is also not quite one person, one vote, it's $1, one vote. But the dollars are also very broadly distributed, but in both cases, they're premised on cognition, will, power, desire, all of them being fragmented among the 8 or 9 billion people on the planet. Each person possesses one stone in this grand mosaic. AI works on a very different principle. What AI does in its current manifestation, in its most successful manifestation, is that it concentrates all knowledge in one location. So ChatGPT has read everything ever written as far as it matters. Yes, okay, not absolutely everything, but it concentrates all knowledge and it distills its abilities from the way it encompasses all knowledge. That requires a complete rethink of how society is going to be organized, and I'm not sure that the thinking and this rethinking is going to be done by us, because what AI provides is potentially a superior level of cognition, and that raises the question of where does that leave us if, in fact, we're talking about superintelligence here, but the extrapolating from current trends, we're not talking about centuries, we're not even talking about decades, we're talking about something that could be pretty close. And we haven't even started thinking about this. I always think that in thinking about eventualities, it's best to concentrate on the worst case, because that's going to be the challenge, rather than a good case or the best case or a favorable outcome and so on. So in this case, we might well find ourselves with a superior cognition, possibly pushing us around and doing things without regard to democracy and possibly without regard to finance as well, to business and finance, because these are also fragmented models. Now, what form this will take, no one quite knows. There is a view which I'm inclined to support, to go with, that the current logic of this technology is concentration, because it's economies to scale. And when you have economies to scale, that leads to monopoly. We won't get an international monopoly because of the nation state, the structure of states. That's not going to disappear, but we're going to get competition among states. We've just decided not to participate by canceling our single large compute project that could have allowed us to participate in this. That's the first thing Labour did when they came into power. So that's a whole vocabulary world which we haven't even started thinking about, but which is taking place, which is actually moving from 1 month to the next, increasing its capabilities, doing things we can't even guess. So I don't think things are going to stay the same.
No. So you're almost suggesting it's not artificial intelligence, but autocratic intelligence.
Well, if it's superior, it's autocratic by nature. It's very difficult to challenge.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we're now starting to stray into areas where perhaps as historians it's difficult. We have very good 2020 backward vision, perhaps less good 2020 forward vision.
I'm not quite sure, by the way, about that, because we've seen how these things take place. We've seen technological revolutions before.
Precisely.
Which I think most decision makers today are not actually equipped with.
Yeah. Well, perhaps that is one note to finish on, which is perhaps a self-satisfied, a self-justifying note, which is as historians, we can understand long-term change, which is perhaps something which modern economics doesn't have. They don't really understand history. So one thing we should do for economists is give them a large dose of history. And thank you, Avner, for doing that for us today.
Thank you very much.